Hello, this is Justin Williams with the Wolfpacker Podcast. I'm joined today by a regular guest host. We haven't had him on in a few months, Brian Geisinger of ACCSports.com, basketball guru, college and NBA. You can also check out his work on the BuzzBeat podcast covering the Charlotte Hornets. He's also a co-host on Sports Channel 8, the radio show on 99.9 The Fan in Raleigh. Glad to have Brian back on. Before we get too far into this episode, this podcast is brought to you in part by JFQ Lending. As we blitz into 2021, JFQ Lending wants the Wolfpacker.com members to take advantage of historically low mortgage rates. JFQ Lending has a Better Business Bureau A rating with over 2,000 reviews. They work with top lenders and do the hard work of finding the best deal for you. If you're curious whether refinancing your mortgage is a good decision, visit jfqlending.com today. That's jfqlending.com. And for our listeners at home, please remember to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast wherever you listen to us. We're on the Apple Podcast app, Spotify, Google Play, pretty much everywhere you listen to podcasts. Plus, you can always stream us on the Wolfpacker.com. While you're there, use that promo code PACK60 for a free 60-day trial on all of our premium content, news, and analysis. And you can always watch us on our YouTube channel. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel while you're there and give this video a thumbs up. All right, Brian, good to see you. As I mentioned before we started this podcast, you got a fresh cut, looking good. We're past the college basketball season. I know you're probably still shoulder deep in NBA film and watching all those games, but maybe a little bit of a breather on your end now that there's not so many college games to watch. But I guess to get us started, man, how you been doing these last couple months, and what'd you think of the NCAA tournament and kind of the conclusion of the college basketball season?
Yeah, it's hey, you're right. My workload has as far as live basketball to watch, it's really dropped in the last couple of weeks, which is I always get a little bummed when the season ends, because it's so much fun. But from a stress level, it's nice to sort of have less on your plate now. It's really just NBA and college offseason stuff with the transfer market and draft, but it's just sort of less night to night inventory. I watch every state game, I watch every Duke game, I watch every Virginia game, every UNC game, pretty much every FSU game, and just every Louisville game. And so just to have that stuff out of the picture is it makes things a little bit easier. But the college season, I don't know about you, man, but I almost can't believe it happened. That this is just the weirdest season ever. And it continues to be unique because of the way the transfer portal is shaping out to be such a game changer this offseason. But just the stops, the starts, all the COVID pauses, the way the ACC tournament seemed to be unraveling for a period of time, with Duke leaving, with Virginia the day after they have a buzzer beater win over Syracuse, they have to leave because of COVID. VCU doesn't get a play in the NCAA tournament. But and ultimately I thought the tournament was pretty good, pretty entertaining. Thought there were some really compelling games. We got the championship matchup I think that most of us wanted. Would have been cool to have seen Michigan at full strength with Isaiah Livers, who's a very good player. But ultimately getting Gonzaga and Baylor was pretty cool. And I thought, Baylor sort of blitzed them the first handful of minutes of that game and then really sort of held on, but was a pretty competitive game, I thought. Really, Baylor dominated, to be clear, but I thought Gonzaga mostly played them sort of even outside of the start. But I don't know, man. I'm relieved that the season is over with. I'm thrilled that next season won't be as stressful and as tenuous as this one. It won't be such a grind, hopefully, for the players next season. So I don't know. I'm kind of amazed that it happened, honestly.
As someone that may or may not have had a vested interest in the Zags in the national title game, I think your review of the national title game was a little bit friendly to the Zags. That to me it just seemed like a blowout and a kind of a disappointment because you thought there was so much hype going into that game, this is going to be the best national title matchup in of the decade, and then it's a 20-point game more or less. I mean, we're like on the edge of our seats. Oh, the Zags cut it to 9 points in the second half.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, Baylor they just big boyed them.
It's a great, and that like the Baylor team, they've got 2 NBA guards on that roster, deep team, lots of shooting. They put Drew Timme in ball screen action, and they just crushed Gonzaga repeatedly going through all of that stuff. And like, it was not a good showing down the stretch of the season for Corey Kispert, for Gonzaga, who like did not play great against UCLA in the Final Four and didn't play great against Baylor. They really like needed his shooting. I think ultimately Gonzaga was done in by like the lack of a two-way big guy. You know, like Anton Watson's good on defense, but he can't score. Timmy's a phenomenal offensive big guy in college, but struggles defensively. The lack of that and the lack of three-point shooting, I think, really did them in. And Baylor sort of like exposed those two things, which had previously for the most of the season had been like sort of like left unchecked. And then against another super elite team. It was not
tough night for Drew Timme. Tough night.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know. I'm a guy that's all about having fun on the court, but the whole mustache thing when you're down 15 points, that was I was like, give it a rest, man. But look,
I thought that was, once he did that, I just started laughing because I was like, I don't even care that he did this, but it's just funny that he did this, you know?
Right. And I'm with you. It was a weird season, man. I thought one of my biggest takeaways was college basketball missed fans so much more than college football did. I mean, that's not to discount that, you know, there's some great college football environments, and, you know, that's going to be great to have fans back in stands this fall for football. But at least when you were watching football, it still felt like a college football game more or less once the action started unraveling. College basketball, there's times where you just tune in for games and it's like, this is weird. This is just so weird, particularly being at the actual games without fans. It's such a big dynamic in the game.
I don't think there's any sport, college or pro, professionally, that we all like to watch here in America that, I mean, everyone missed not having fans there because of COVID, for sure. I think college basketball missed the most because of that. It's such an integral part of the game to have the student sections and the pageantry and all of that. It's right on top of the action. If you think of like the Cameron Crazies or whatever, it's like where the court ends, like the fan section is right there. And so, I think college basketball really, really missed having that this season. It was just not the same without sort of like a raucous crowd at all times, or not even just like a hyped crowd, but like even like the anxiety of a home crowd, which I think you and I talked about this a while ago. Like maybe that was to like State's benefits at times this season, you know, to not have like the when State's not playing so great at home, to not have the home section like getting like, you know, frustrated with the team or whatever, and does that impact the team's performance or whatever. But yes, in general, I think fans were sorely missed in college hoops this year.
And granted, we did have that conversation shortly after NC State knocked off UNC at home. Something that they did not do regularly when Roy Williams was there in Chapel Hill. Of course, he's gone now. Big topic in the offseason. We're not going to dive too much into that. Obviously, I'm sure NC State fans aren't losing any sleep over Roy not showing up on the other sideline ever again in an NC State-UNC game. But I do think the fans could have helped when NC State was making that second half push against Miami. You know, a snoozer of a noon game on a Saturday in the middle of the ACC slate. You kind of think the fans are there to back up the run. Maybe Miami doesn't come back and win that game. That was one of many coulda, shoulda, wouldas, what ifs of NC State season. I think what if is kind of a good term to kind of wrap up NC State season. I'm curious to get your perspective on kind of how you view this season for NC State. I know, obviously, you know, being a college basketball writer, reporter, you know, we're just happy that there was a season, and I think anybody that was able to get to the finish line can somewhat call this past year a success. NC State was so plagued with injuries, it's really hard to tell whether or not you could call this season a success. I mean, obviously the goal was to get to the NCAA tournament. I think a full-strength NC State team, that was a very reasonable goal within reach. There's just so much adversity that this team faced. It's kind of hard to grade this year for the Wolfpack just considering all of the what-ifs. How do you see it, Brian?
Yeah, I mean, you like your outline was spot on. Like, I think not just for State, for every team, it's sort of weird to grade this season just because every team had, multiple, except for UNC, had like, multiple pauses with COVID or whatever. Injuries played a huge role in this season. And I think it's hard to even, if you're going to look at State's season though, really before and after the Daniels injury, because that was such a pivotal moment in the year for State to lose their offensive alpha, their best creator in the half court. You and I talked about this a lot, and it was, to have Daniels go out and what should have been like a good get-right win at home over Wake Forest, just like, it changed the season. But I thought if you're going to look at positives for State, they won, 6 of the last 8 games over the season. The only 2 losses were Syracuse at the ACC tournament and Colorado State in the NIT. I thought State did a nice job the last month of the season. Again, after it took them some time to readjust once Daniels went down, but they had some good wins in that mix, including beating Virginia, beating Notre Dame, beating Davidson in the NIT. Those NIT games are kind of weird, but nothing like beating Bob McKillop in a good Davidson team, nothing to sneeze at. And State had one of their best offensive games of the season in that game, which was pretty impressive. But I thought they did a nice job changing up the mix offensively. This is something I wrote about extensively at ACCsports.com. Just State using more off-ball actions to try to get someone like Braxton Beverly open for threes or Jericho Helms open for jump shots, playing through the post more with DJ Funderburk and Manny Bates, which, I'm not the biggest fan of heavy post-up action, but worked for them on some nights. But I just thought the vibes were good for them late in the season. And it, I'm not the biggest believer in really carrying momentum from the end of one season to the start of the next season, especially since there's these rosters change so much in college basketball. But I thought there was some tangible things you could take away from late in the season that mattered and I think could be important for them going forward. So yeah, the season ultimately is a disappointment after such a nice start. But State really ended up, they were 9th in the ACC. I think that's where they finished up. That's around, I think I had them probably, that's right around where I think I voted for them during the preseason, was around 8 or 9. But all those expectations started to change once they got off to such a great start. And really after they beat UNC right before the winter break, that was when the expectations really started to jump off. And look, maybe that UNC team really wasn't quite as good as maybe we were even thinking they would be at the time. But yeah, the Clemson loss and the Miami loss, and then stuff just started to snowball after that. And it was 2 weeks later, Daniels goes down, they're reeling. And I do think that they did a nice job bouncing back, and assuming State's roster is able to hold intact, I think you can feel reasonably comfortable about a couple of different things. I don't think the pieces fit perfectly on this year's roster. We've talked about this, but just the contrast of Bates and Funderburk, 2 very good players, right? 2 very, very good players, but not excellent complementary pieces, right?
But they kind of made it work with both of them on the floor.
They did.
The end of the year.
Yeah, they did. And a lot of that is a testament to DJ. I also thought it was funny that he started hitting some jumpers in the NIT. It was it was wow, really save these for the end here, man. DJ was one of those guys, he always flirted with the pick and pop jumper at State, but it just never really happened. And then he hit a couple at the bottom of the 9th of his career, which is kind of funny. But yeah, I mean, I really thought some of their best lineups featured, Helms at the 4 with one of those big guys on the court. But like you said, they made it work. I thought the Manny Bates had some nice passing flashes late in the season. he's not Nikola Jokic, like
No.
he's not Arvydas Sabonis. You don't really want to run offense through this guy, but he made a couple like nice big to big passes to Funderburk that I thought showed. I think it was maybe one of the Pittsburgh wins. I thought the like interior front court passing was really solid. So they did kind of make it work, and I thought some of that had to do with the adjustments that Keats and his staff made after Daniels hurt, including mixing in some stuff that like State just straight up hasn't done, at least in the last 3 seasons. But good screen-to-screener actions, Buckeye action. I just thought they mixed in some nice stuff. So ultimately, I think it's a disappointing season, but I don't know, man. Like this, they ended up having the best defense probably Keats has ever, depending on like what metrics you're looking at. This was the best defense that Keats has put together. Certainly not efficient, not like an elite defense, but by some efficiency metrics, they were top 60, top 65 nationally defensive efficiency. They were top 30 or 40 in offensive efficiency, despite the fact that they had like young guards and, again, pieces that didn't fit together perfectly. So I think there's some positives to take away. I think there's some stuff to be like concerned about going forward, but ultimately just probably should feel lucky that they were able to get a season in and play, 25 games. And again, I think the vibes seemed to be good late in the season. And I think the fact that they wanted to play in the NIT and that they played pretty well in those 2 games is a testament to the fact that like this team they could have broken apart. And they actually sort of like stuck together. I think DJ Funderburk gets a lot of credit for that.
I think you also have to tip your cap to Kevin Keats on that too.
Yes, 100%. He got buy-in from this team at probably the hardest moment of his career to get buy-in, outside of like maybe at the start of his career at State. Like lost season, weird season, COVID, the injuries. It would have been really easy for everyone to just say like F this, like let's just go through the motions and finish this thing out. But they found another gear later in the season, and they clearly wanted to keep playing basketball. So I think there are, even though it's maybe a little bit of a disappointing season, there are still plenty of good things to sort of take away and perhaps hopefully build on going forward here.
Well, let's talk about one of those main positives, particularly towards the end of the season that we saw. I think the last time we had you on, it was right before they traveled up to Pittsburgh, which was the first of the 5-game win streak at the end of the regular season. And that podcast, one of our main messages was, here are the things that you should watch for the rest of the season. We were kind of warning fans to say, this is not about making the NCAA tournament. It's very much a long shot. They would have had to win all those games. Losing the Virginia Tech home finale really hurt them. I think that could have made them present a better case going to Greensboro. If they had won maybe 2 games in Greensboro, maybe they have a case to sneak in the tournament. But more or less at that point, it was a moot point. But one of the more tangible things that I think we were advising fans to watch for is the development of those young guards, particularly Cam Hayes, who had struggled in ACC play up to that point. And particularly Cam Hayes showed out. I mean, that Pittsburgh game was kind of his breakthrough moment in ACC play past, the initial COVID pause in December. He played pretty well in limited minutes against UNC in that home win in the ACC opener. But after that, he didn't have a lot to write home about all the way up until the Pittsburgh game, where he had a career high, I think 9 assists off the top of my head, double-digit scoring. I think that was the first time he had a double-digit scoring total in ACC play up to that point. And, all 3 of the freshman guards, Shaquille Moore and Darion Sebron as well, really showed some flashes and showed their potential of why Kevin Keats was so excited about this young backcourt. And granted, it's frustrating to rely on a freshman backcourt, but that was the situation NC State was in, particularly at the end of the season. Once you lose Daniels, once you lose Thomas Allen, a guy who, had his own struggles and had his own limitations, but nonetheless was a experienced guy in that backcourt that could have helped with some rotational minutes down the stretch. What did you see from those 3 freshman guards in that last stretch of the season, in the regular season and the postseason? I know they had a couple of no-shows They didn't play particularly great against Syracuse. They didn't play well at all against Colorado State in the NIT loss that ended the season. They actually got bailed out by the veterans in that home game against Pittsburgh, which I believe was the second to last game of the regular season. But all four of the other regular season games to end the season, plus the Davidson win in the NIT, they played really well. And you almost look back to that road game against Virginia. I mean, you can credit the freshmen directly for winning that game up in Charlottesville. So what'd you see from them that encourages you, and maybe what would be the one thing or the one player that maybe excited you the most down the stretch?
Yeah, this is an important area to touch on. In fact, I think it's like maybe the most important thing to evaluate a state is transitioning from the end of this season to next season. Is Cam Hayes, Shaquille Moore, and Darion Sebron. Like you mentioned Allen too. Like with Thomas Allen, he's easy because just like what he is. He's a pure floor spacer, low usage, low mistake, low turnover, catch and shoot, and like they need Thomas Allen to like, because they're losing Braxton Beverly. Thomas Allen's going to have to make spot up. He's got to be in the high 30s at least next season on catch and shoot threes. Like period. He's just got to have from Allen next season. He's got to be their spot up ace. I thought the flashes with Cam Hayes were pretty impressive this year. Smooth pick and roll operator. His efficiency numbers out of the pick and roll were pretty darn good this season. Good pull-up shooter, shot very well off the dribble. We'll see on a relatively lower sample. I mean, we'll see how much some of that translates. But yeah, you mentioned like the Pittsburgh game, but he was also great against Notre Dame. In that game, he was awesome in that game. He was great against Virginia on the road. Hit some huge shots. Got to I think he had 8 free throw attempts in that Virginia game too, which for him was probably a career high. I'd have to double check that, but Hayes didn't really get to the line all that much this year. So like that's something that, and so this gets to my thought on Hayes. I really like him. I think he's a really good player. I think he's can be a guy that can be a big time, like, pick and roll engine for State. And that's exactly what they need. And it was always going to be tough this season. You lose Markell, who was the pick and roll ace for this team the last couple of years. Daniels came in. He really helped with that. Then once he went down, you're sort of scrambling, and a lot was really put on more in Hayes' plate. So my thought would be, can Cam Hayes get to the rim more next season? And can he get to the line more? Just according to Bart Torvik's site, Hayes just 10 of 27 on field goal attempts at the rim this year. So like low volume, low efficiency, only a 26% free throw attempt rate. He only drew about 3.2 fouls per 40 minutes. So like, Hayes is smooth, right? And he sees the court. He's a good pull-up shooter, but I'd like to see him be able to like put more pressure on the rim. If he's a guy that's going to have the ball in his hands a lot, I'd like to see him get downhill just a little bit more, as opposed to really just like relying on the pull-up jumper. It's great that he has that. And that's something that he can play off the threat of the pull-up jumper. But I'd like to see him get to the rim a little bit more. I like his hands defensively, super quick hands. I think because Shaquille Moore is such a powerful defender that Hayes' sort of like skill on that end got lost a little bit this year, but a guy that forced a fair amount of turnovers. This stretch of games that State was winning at the end of the season, he had I think he had multiple steals in basically every game. Hayes did. So like that's important. He uses that to get into transition, and that's like sort of like one of his better areas on the court as well. So there's a lot on his plate because he's being asked to be like the primary creator for an offense that runs the pick and roll, as much as anybody, if not more than anyone in the ACC. So that's a lot to ask. So his development's going to be huge there. And just, can he be more of a pressure point for them at the rim? With Shaquille Moore, you want to talk about a special athlete for the guard position, man. I would say he's in like the 99th percentile for 6-foot guards, right? As far as like athleticism goes, long arms, quick, twitchy, strong, like incredibly explosive vertical leaper. I really do think the block he had up at Boston College on the 3-point attempt, I think that got like lost in the shuffle this year in terms of like craziest defensive plays that happened in the ACC. And like, I know it was a Boston College team that was missing basically its entire roster in a lost season for BC. And I know no one was probably watching that game unless you were a State fan. But dude, he jumped from like a step outside the lane to block a 3-point attempt. And look, Shaquille Moore blocked a bunch of 3-point attempts this season, which like that's rare in and of itself. To be like a 6-foot guard and to be able to block threes like that is really special. I love his point of attack defense. I love his on-ball defense. His ability to get into a stance and slide and be really disruptive at the top of State's defense was really impressive this year. There were a variety of good freshman guard defenders in the ACC this year. Reese Beekman at Virginia, Kadari Richmond at Syracuse. Now he's at Seton Hall. We didn't get to see much of Earl Timberlake at Miami. He's now at Memphis. But Moore was, on par with those guys in terms of like impact defensively from a rookie guard. Was really impressive. And I thought he was a pretty good off-ball defender. Like his ability to sort of like, read passes, intercept passes, and use that to like ignite transition. Pretty impressive too. Just a really interesting young defender. I thought his pick and roll offense was relatively impressive this season too. Showed the ability to make layered reads, showed the ability to improvise some as well. Sees the court, I think, pretty well. And like, State, when they're running pick and roll, they're really giving their ball handlers like 1 or 2 reads, right? It's like run the pick and roll, look for the roll guy. If that's not there, then, swing it or look for your shot, right? Like that's sort of how it's pretty simple, right? But it's good offense too. And I thought Moore did like a pretty good job at times with that. He's got to become more careful with the basketball. He's got to become a better pull-up shooter. But I thought his spot-up shooting was pretty good this season. He was right around 36, 37% on catch-and-shoot threes. That's a good number. He's nice attacking closeouts. So, like, I'm hopeful that we get to see a lot of, like, Shaquille Moore and Cam Hayes play together. Because I think there is a reality where those two guys exist as the starting backcourt of the future for State. And it works well. Like I think, and they both can still get plenty of playmaking possessions. They can get off the ball and they can be disruptive defensively. And then with Darion Sebron, like I thought he had a really nice finish to the season, man. Like just was really important for State in some of their big wins. He's so long on the wing, really fun player to watch, like in the open court in transition. I think that's really when you see him sort of like at his best playmaking. And they gave him some half-court pick-and-roll looks as well. Without Devin Daniels, there was some opportunity there. And without Thomas Allen, there was some opportunity there. And you saw them running some of those side pick-and-roll actions with Sebron. But I really thought his best playmaking opportunities came in the open court. And so the thing for him will be, how much more efficient can he be in the half-court next season? They're going to need other guys to create offense outside of Hayes and Moore. And Sebron is probably like at the top of the list, at least as far as like returning guys go. I like him as an off-ball cutter. I think he moves without the ball pretty well. Like I think he does stuff offensively because he's not a great shooter that can sort of like counteract the fact that he's not a great shooter. So cutting, moving without the basketball, getting on the glass, like that sort of stuff can help State on the margins. And I think Sebron does some of that stuff pretty well. So all three of those guys are I think are really interesting as like different guys who have some similarities in terms of like how they want to hold the ball, have the ball, especially Hayes and Moore. But I think you can find an ecosystem where all of those guys sort of like coexist. And that ultimately will like determine just how good State probably is next season is like, how do those guys fit and how well can they play off of one another? I think there are some realities where it could be really, really good.
Yeah, Brian, I think you made some really good points about all three of those guys. I want to talk a little bit about Darion Sebron because I know he's a guy that on our last podcast, I think admittedly I had some questions about, his ability, his role in this system to be potentially the number one wing on this team. The jump shot was a little bit spotty. Sometimes he was turnover prone. Sometimes it appeared like he was a little bit lost on the offensive end, which, again, are not rare things for a freshman player. But I think he answered a lot of questions down the stretch of the season, and he really showcased how elite of a rebounder he can be for this team. I mean, there were some flashes where he was really NC State's best rebounder, even more so than the two big guys on the floor in Manny Bates and DJ Funderburk. I mean, rebounding was never really Funderburk's strength, and rebounding is also something that Bates is still developing. He has the potential to be a really good rebounder, but it's still kind of coming along. Sebron almost has that natural ability just with his length. He just crashes the boards. He had some really nice putback attempts. And he really started finishing in transition, which was a problem from him early on in the season, where it's like he's so athletic and so lengthy, you can just see how he can fit right into Keats' system of creating turnovers on the defensive end, turning it into offense in the fast break. But then he'd have those opportunities early on in the season. It's like he didn't know what to do once he got to the rim, or he'd try to dunk it and he'd miss the dunk, or he'd get blocked at the rim by, a trailing defender. And it all started to kind of come together for him towards the end of the season. So with Hayes, I knew it was in Hayes for him to have the finish to the season like he did. I think we kind of knew the athleticism that you got with Shaquille Moore, and I'd say of all three of those guys, he was probably the most consistent all season. Sebron's performance down the stretch somewhat surprised me, and I think it was almost, kind of a silver lining to the Daniels injury. I mean, granted, none of us want that type of situation for anybody, but because Daniels was out, I mean, if Daniels was still playing down the stretch of the season, he's going to be playing 35, 40 minutes a game. Sebron's not going to be on the court for all those valuable minutes. So, in a sense, he's almost a little bit ahead of schedule because of the situation that NC State was put in. And it could pay dividends as soon as next season because, if Daniels finishes out that season, he's probably an all-ACC guy. He's gone. I think he's still gone either way. We don't have an official decision from him or Funderburk yet. Funderburk definitely sounded like a guy that had played his, quote, last game after that NIT loss. Obviously, Beverly transferred out. But Sebron's going to be a huge factor on this team, a starting contender for this team. They had that nice little starting lineup with Sebron and Hayes, and they started Beverly a little bit. They had Manny Bates, Jericho Helms, and Funderburk for most of the end of the stretch starting lineup, and that really worked. That was kind of the lineup they went to once the winning streak happened. But, what do you see the ceiling for these three guys being? I mean, are any of these guys jump out to you as potential all-ACC talents if they stay in the process, stay in Keats' system, and continue to develop? Or, of all three of those guys, who do you think might have the highest ceiling?
Yeah, it's tough to say. I think more just because of his athleticism and because he can be so impactful defensively. So, but I think all of those guys have very real potential. Especially if Hayes proves to be like this kind of like pull up shooter, then that opens up a world of opportunities for him, right? That kind of skill, being able to shoot efficiently off the dribble is like the most important offensive skill to have, or certainly one of them. So, but I just think more because he is such a special athlete, even at his size, Sebron, his frame is so enticing. He looks like he's so skinny, but so long, and can really sort of just like glide all over the court. When I think of Sebron this season, I'll think of like the grab and go finishes in transition where he grabbed the board, push it off his own dribble, and then finish. He really became like sort of one of the top grab and go guys in the ACC just over the final, 6 weeks of the season or whatever, which I thought was pretty impressive. Like being able to do stuff like that it's not easy to grab a rebound and then go the length of the court and, weave through three defenders and finish at the rim. And he ended up finishing with like 15 dunks this season too. So I like a lot of what Sebron did. His flashes the last month of the season, I think were pretty enticing. And really, it was it was that Notre Dame game that really it's something to dream on, right? When you see like what he's able to do in those scenarios. Like I think that what he had like 3 or 4 offensive rebounds in that game. He had 3 blocks.
Yeah.
I think he was 7 of 9 at the rim, which is for him is the best game he had all season, finishing at the rim, like in terms of volume and efficiency. So that game really like is the one that yeah, makes you wonder just how impactful could this guy be. There are going to be a ton of opportunities for him on the wing next season. But I do think as far as like just sort of like upward potential, I think I would say more because of the athleticism and his ability to like drive and be like a two-way guard. But all of those guys sort of offer different things that they can like tempt you with in terms of thinking like, wow, if they really get to like to their ceiling as a player, like all of these guys could be all ACC type talents, right? Hayes, the pick and roll creator that can, shoot pull up jumpers. Sebron, the do it all wing, that can really be a force in transition and more just like the two-way, the two-way force at the point of attack, both as like a secondary or primary creator and a lead dog defensively. So, but yeah, I just thought Sebron, what he did at the end of the season was pretty impressive. And the Notre Dame game obviously was like pretty special for him. And just wanted to tie this up to, you mentioned Daniels and Funderburk. I assume both those guys are gone. Yeah. Best of luck to them with starting their pro careers. Neither of those guys are really NBA prospects, but they're certainly professional basketball players, somewhere on planet Earth next year. Right. But as you mentioned, like because of the NCAA's eligibility rules, like even seniors have to declare for the draft this year, right? So at some point, those guys will do that, But like we've seen Jay Huff, Sam Hauser, some of these other guys have done in the ACC have already done that. But yeah, because of the NCAA's eligibility COVID rules, seniors have to declare for the draft this season too, which that isn't always the case in years past.
Yeah, and Daniels is the only one that I could see maybe making a little bit of sense just because of the ACL, season-ending injury.
Right,
I mean, he was on track to have an all-ACC type of season. I mean, if he continued his play, he might have been a second-team type of guy just based on what the talent level in the ACC was this year. And he could arguably be one of the best players in the ACC if he did decide to return. I think he's also the only guy that it's within the realm of possibility, but from all indications that I'm hearing, it doesn't seem likely just because, I mean, the guy's played 5 collegiate seasons. He was a transfer from Utah. He's, played basketball around the country. I mean, he's already in his early to mid-20s, just like Beverly, just like Funderburk, so you can't blame the guy if he wants to go start collecting a paycheck for his talent, but with Sebron, it seemed like it just kind of clicked overnight for him. It was kind of weird. It was almost like one day Keats was like, I really just need you to play aggressive. And then one day he just started listening. And then that Wake Forest game happened when they hammered the Demon Deacons on the road in Winston-Salem. I mean, granted, at that point, Wake Forest had kind of thrown in the towel for the season. But it was a great opportunity for those freshmen at NC State to really showcase their skills. That was one where they had all collectively played well, particularly Sebron. He was the one that made the flash. I think he led the team in scoring that game. I don't have the stats right in front of me. But let's talk a little bit about the transfer portal because I know that's the hot topic of the offseason. And obviously NC State's been connected to some big names out there on the transfer portal. They did land a couple of new additions. I think maybe the buzz and excitement of not necessarily landing one of the big name guys maybe has fans a little bit discouraged, but I'd also remind fans to keep in mind that it's not just picking up new additions, it's also maintaining your current personnel. And based on the fact that, Braxton Beverly and Nick Farrar are the only 2 guys from NC State that have announced their intent to enter the transfer portal. Both those guys have new landing spots, Beverly with Eastern Kentucky and Farrar with College of Charleston. You're talking about Beverly, a guy that by no stretch of the imagination was a guarantee to come back. It's probably a mutually beneficial decision for him to go ahead and move on just because, I mean, look, he'd love to have his perimeter shooting back. He'd love to have his seniority and his experience back, but he's always been a guy where the size has been a huge dilemma in the ACC, and I think it's probably, best for both ways for him to go ball out at Eastern Kentucky, have one hell of a senior season, and for NC State to kind of move on with some of their younger backcourt pieces. And then Farrar, a guy that, just didn't play much at all in his first season. I mean, you don't know what his potential could be. Maybe he'll and be a star at College of Charleston, but it didn't even seem like there was a pathway towards even cracking that rotation next season. So it's kind of a decision that made sense. But, the fact that you have all three of those freshman guards realistically coming back, unless there's some surprise decision here in the next couple weeks,
it's huge.
I would consider that a huge win for NC State, even if they don't necessarily get one of the big names out there. Like, obviously, NC State was in the running for Jaden Garner, a guy that was a first-team All-American Athletic Conference guy, a guy that really would have been a valuable addition for NC State. He ends up picking Virginia. Maybe it's just a better system fit for him. Maybe he's just, more interested in kind of the national clout that Virginia has. I mean, look, it's the most recent ACC program to win a national title. So, when you're competing with that type of program, you're not always going to win. But, you get a couple of new additions and guys that it's kind of interesting because both of the Greg Gantt from Providence and Casey Morsell from Virginia, there's almost kind of a similar story with both of these guys. Highly touted recruits, 4-star guys that are, top 50, top 60 overall prospects in their respective classes. They go to Power 6 programs. They dabble in the rotation. They get limited starts. They don't play a ton. Their usage isn't super high. Their numbers aren't going to wow you by any means from their first 2 seasons at the college level, but maybe a new start is what exactly these guys need. I know you mentioned before the podcast that you're very familiar with Casey Morsell, considering that you follow Virginia so closely. So let's start with him, a 6'3" guard that saw his minutes kind of decline a little bit last year in the rotation. I know he started a good chunk of games for the Cavaliers 2 seasons ago. So what do you see in Morsell, a guy that's 6'3", nice frame in the backcourt? NC State could use some size in that backcourt considering some of the shorter guards that they have in Shaquille Moore and Thomas Allen. A guy that, just frankly didn't shoot the ball well the last 2 seasons, but it seems like a guy that shot the ball well in high school and just maybe it hasn't translated immediately to the college level, something that maybe he can find once he gets to a new destination at NC State.
Yeah, you named – I actually covered Casey Morsell's recruitment at ACCsports.com. I mean, he was a big-time recruit.
Yeah.
Dominated the D.C. prep scene, which we know that's one of the best sort of like areas for basketball talent in all the country. Was in the USA basketball development system. He came in with a lot of hype around him. And you mentioned great frame, 6'3", almost 200 pounds, like stocky, well built. Looks like a guy that should really could really be a just like a nice power guard. And we'll get to some of his issues in a second here. But my first thought is, it's going to be crazy to see. He's about to have, in terms of style of play on both sides of the basketball, there's about to be a big change ahead for Casey Morsell. And I think the hope is that you're making a talent play, right? This guy was a great recruit, checks a lot of those boxes, great size, good pedigree. So if we just get him in a system, he was not a good fit in Virginia's system. But can we put him in this offensive system at State, and can we use that to get the sort of the best out of him? Really try to fully actualize his talent. I think that's the play that you're making, the talent play that you're making if you're Kevin Keatts and NC State, because at Virginia, they've run more pick and roll in recent years. But really, unless you're Kihei Clark or Reese Beekman, you don't run pick and roll there. It's their primary guards that run pick and roll. It's not their secondary guards. But you're leaving an offense that is mostly predicated on off-ball movements, the blocker mover, inside motion. These offenses that had Casey Morsell running off screens away from the basketball, or in inside motion, really just sort of space to the corner. And it was not a good fit with Morsell. It's now that you're coming to NC State, probably more pick and roll usage. He only used, according to Synergy Sports, Casey Morsell used only 12 pick and roll possessions this season at Virginia. That's about to jump up way high.
Yeah, he could do that in one game at NC State.
Yeah, I imagine you're going to see him used in a lot of the same ways that that like Devin Daniels and Sebron were used, which is they love to run those Iverson screens into side pick and roll. And I'm sure that's where you'll see Casey Morsell used a fair amount, but also defensively, like to go from like the pack line, which is all about packing the paint, controlling the gaps. You're going to give up a lot of threes, but you want to contest those threes, to State, where Casey Morsell is going to be asked to switch a lot more now, right? State switches most actions, most exchanges 1 through 4, and they drop with their center, Manny Bates, although they will occasionally switch 1 through 5, as they did against Virginia during the win up in Charlottesville. So Morsell's going to be it's just going to be a sea change for him on both sides of the court, right? And I'm fascinated to see how he adjusts to that. And I think there's just the hope is that change, along with some growth and development, that allows you to sort of like unlock the player that a lot of people who cover recruiting, cover prep basketball, thought Casey Morsell could be as of 2 years ago. He really struggled to shoot the basketball at Virginia. His freshman year, he was below 18% on threes. I looked this up earlier. Only 8 ACC players since the 92-93 season have attempted at least 50 3-pointers in a season and shot 20 or less, like below 20% on those threes. So that was Morsell his freshman year. One of the other 8 guys to do that was his former teammate Braxton Key, who also did it in the same year. If you remember, Virginia last season was really struggled, really choked for offense. He improved a lot as a shooter this year, but he was so bad his freshman year that even though he improved a fair amount, still not a great shooter, but jumped to 26% on threes, 47% on twos. So ultimately was still not a very good shooter, but there was significant improvement in those percentages from year 1 to year 2. My question is, where does he land as a shooter at NC State? State needs him to shoot better than this, right? These are all below average numbers. He's a 20% career 3-point shooter. Like, that's just not going to get it done. At State, there'll probably be less spacing around him, more on-ball responsibilities. But as we discussed earlier in the pod, those reads can be pretty simple, right? Come off the screen. When you're going to see him run these side pick and rolls, Jericho Helms will pop to the corner. And for Casey Morsell, it's going to be either throw it to Helms if he's open, look for your own shot, or kick it out to the other side, right? And like that. And so my hope is that simplicity of just like putting guys into these good situations where you're running empty corner, empty side pick and roll. My hope is that you're able to unlock some goodness out of Casey Morsell with that. I do worry some because one of the things Morsell fell back on so much when he was at Virginia across both seasons was his pull-up jumper from the mid-range area, which he's not a very good pull-up shooter. I'm a little concerned that at State you're going to see too much of that he's going to come off these screens, and instead of like attacking the rim, you're going to see him settling for a lot of like 17, 18-foot pull-up jumpers. I'm a little worried. That has me like a little worried that we're going to just sort of like trying to like extrapolate Morsell into State's roster. So my hope is that State gears him towards getting to the rim, and that you can say, look, you're 6'3", 200 pounds. You've got a decent first step. We've got to find ways for you to get into the paint more, because that's how you can really help our offense, is by you get into the paint, you get to the line, you finish, you slash and kick. Especially like if they're going to play more. I'm assuming, Helms is obviously he plays a lot at like the small ball floor already, but like next season, my imagination is that he'll play even more of that without DJ Funderburk. You'll see less 2 bigs. You'll see more of these like traditional Keats lineups where it's 4 perimeter guys around 1 big guy. I guess Manny Bates, assuming he's coming back. I mean, I imagine Bates will test the draft process, but who knows? I mean, it's another probably conversation there. But like looking at Morsell, he played about 1,000 minutes at Virginia, right? Across 2 seasons, only 36 career assists in 1,000 minutes, only 25 career free throw attempts in 1,000 minutes at Virginia, drew less than 2 fouls per 40 minutes this season. Like, these numbers have to go way up. Like, he doesn't need to be the primary creator for State's offense. Like, they have those other guys, but like Morcell needs to be able to get to the line more. He's got to be better at setting other guys up. It can't all be come off the pick and roll screen and shoot jumpers. And so that is that I think is like the key for State and Morcell, sort of like unlocking the best version of him, is to really see if you can turn this guy into a downhill driver, and not just letting him sort of like float into the pull up 2-point looks, because like they have guys who can do that already. Like they have Hayes, they have Helms. Those guys are going to take mid-range shots. Like find a way to get this, and some of that stuff is fine, but really find a way to get this guy going to the rim, I think is really where you can find sort of like his best usage. And like he's just going to have to get better at drawing contact. He's going to have to get better at setting other guys up. I mean, these are pretty paltry numbers in terms of like free throw attempts and career assists. While
it seems fixable though. I mean, in terms of, I mean, if you can definitely just engage the mentality to be, drive first type of guard off the ball screens, theoretically, you could find the success, because he wasn't a bad free throw shooter, 74% free throw shooter. I know, granted, with a limited sample size, but you'd have to imagine that could translate, particularly with more volume.
Yes.
So we'll see. Let's talk about Greg Gantt, unless you had another tidbit that you wanted to add.
As of right now, the way the roster looks, I feel like there should be 4 definite starters for State next season. I think you should have Hayes and Moore be the backcourt, Helms at 4, Bates at 5, and I think that 5th spot is open for competition. Allen's the best shooter of that bunch, but I think Morcell has the opportunity to play himself into a starting role. And with that group, he could really help them best by being a downhill driver.
And of course, there's Sebron if you want to get some more length into
thank you. He's the other. Those guys played 90 minutes together this season, Moore, Hayes, and Sebron. But yes, in my mind, that 5th spot is open for competition amongst Sebron, Morcell, and Thomas Allen. Those are the guys. And last thing I want to mention too, because you touched on this with Beverly. I think State will certainly miss Beverly's shooting, and he was like a steady hand for them in terms of like playmaking in the half court this season. Certainly injuries did him in at times, but I do think, as much as I'm sure State would have loved to have Braxton Beverly back, State also gave teams a target to go at defensively, because State switches so much. There were plenty of times the last couple of seasons we saw Beverly get switched on to an opposing 3 or an opposing 4. That person would go to the paint, Beverly would front the post, teams would lob over the top, and they would just pick on that matchup. That's not going to be available next season, right? Yeah. Like there's not, like, all of these guys are bigger, better athletes. And so that should hopefully tighten up State's defense a little bit in terms of like the 1-4 switch matchups.
Yeah, that's great point. I can just remember sitting on the baseline in Greensboro Coliseum and Jim Boeheim's just licking his chops trying to set up. Yes. Even Kadary Richmond, Beverly just didn't have it wasn't a matchup for him. And it doesn't help when Buddy Boeheim's just splashing every time the ball touches his hand. I mean,
he went nuclear for a couple of games in a row there across the ACC and NCAA tournament.
Yeah, it was kind of a unfortunate time to run into the Orangemen. But let's talk a little bit about Greg Gantt, and then I want to wrap it up with talking about some of the main returning pieces with Helms and Bates and kind of where you foresee their role next year. But with Greg Gantt, similar situation, guy that went to Providence for 2 years, limited time, limited usage, numbers aren't going to wow you, but a highly touted recruit. He was the number 55 overall prospect in the 2019 class, according to Rivals. He's a guy from Fayetteville, very familiar with Manny Bates, another Fayetteville native. NC State recruited Gantt out of high school. So did a number of ACC programs. Virginia was in the mix, Virginia Tech, Georgia Tech, Clemson. So, obviously there's talent that interested a lot of Power 5 programs. Kind of an unfortunate personal situation with him, because I don't know if you knew this or not, Brian, but I think his mother passed away his freshman season, and he had a very close relationship with his mother. being a North Carolina guy, going up to Rhode Island, I'm sure that was
Yeah.
probably a time of isolation for him. And then, of course, the next season, it's COVID. So, just unfortunate circumstances up there for him in Providence. We talked to one of the Providence beat writers, and also kind of a system mismatch there where Providence kind of runs a slower type of system, and NC State wasn't exactly a up-tempo team. They were actually kind of slower in pace than they had been the previous 3 seasons under Keats, but I think that returns more back to normalcy next season. Keats is probably going to want to get the tempo going a little bit more, particularly with some of his personnel that he has coming next year. So Gantt, a 6'8", power forward, athletic, not going to be a conventional big man. I wouldn't compare him to DJ Funderburk by any means, but a guy you could see, getting out in transition, being a solid defender that's going to be able to switch 1 through 4 at the very least, even to the 5 in NC State's system. You can definitely see the defensive potential with him. Yes. Maybe he can develop an offensive game. Maybe he can help NC State crash the boards a little bit. But where do you see his role with NC State next year? And do you see him as maybe a guy that could be a diamond in the rough in the sense that, his numbers definitely don't jump off the page like Morcell, but there could be some really solid potential there.
Yeah, I mean, what you just brought up with Gantt, it makes his first 2 seasons of college basketball tough to evaluate, right? You're devastated your freshman year. It's already hard to be a freshman in the Big East. Then you have a personal tragedy like that. Then the next season's COVID. I mean, that's brutal. I mean, really is. So it's hard to take too much away. It's not even like he played that many minutes at Providence too. But as far as the tempo and that sort of stuff goes, I really like Ed Cooley as a coach, but I mean, they're old school in some ways. They run the flex offense, and it's it looks like Gary Williams in Maryland. I mean, it's just curling for mid-range jump shots and stuff. So this will be a little bit different, a little more spread pick and roll, which could be. I'm not I don't know if we'll see Gantt really playing on the ball all that much, although 14% assist rate this season. So there's some playmaking, some creation there. I think the main thing it comes down to is just his frame, 6'7", 6'8", 220 pounds, whatever, long, rangy. You really can't have enough guys like this on a roster, right? In his freshman season, 3% steal rate, 2.5% block rate. Maybe he can be a guy that can be a little bit of an event creator for them defensively. I think that would be huge. I mean, what Manny Bates brings as a rim protector. What Shaquille Moore brings at the point of attack, but and see what Sebron could be for them on the wing. But have another guy like Gantt, that could be pretty nice. I'll be fascinated to see where he fits in. Is he going to be the next sort of flex forward for NC State, right? When Keats showed up, this became Torrin Dorn, that became Jericho Helms, and can Gantt be that type of player, the sort of small ball 4? Or, is he going to have to be a guy that plays more of a – I'll just be fascinated to see, where he fits into the rotation. But from an athleticism standpoint, from a frame standpoint, it does seem like it checks a couple of boxes for State. So I've seen a little bit of Gantt. I watched a fair amount of Big East ball. I've seen probably every game Morcell played in at State – or pardon me, at Virginia. I've obviously not seen Gantt nearly that much. But I think it could be potentially be a solid ad for State. And I just hope it'd be nice for him to have a normal basketball season, I would imagine. Get close to home and for the first time ever get to have as normal of a college life as you've possibly been able to have. So, but we'll see. Adding some size and athleticism certainly doesn't hurt, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, to our earlier point, I think we kind of touched on this a little bit. I mean, one of the biggest questions for NC State next season is how they're going to replace the production of DJ Funderburk and the role that he played. I mean, there were times where he, frankly, had some disappointing moments early on in the season, but really had a sneaky solid year. I mean, he was really NC State's star down the stretch of the season, and particularly in the NIT, you could tell, I mean, those games really mattered to DJ Funderburk. He really wanted to go out on a high note. He was very emotional after the NIT loss to Colorado State. And we mentioned Jaden Garner, obviously, commits to Virginia. He was kind of the option A, would have been, I mean, potential not even potential, probable upgrade from DJ Funderburk for that role, just based on what he was able to do at ECU and in the American Athletic Conference. But a solid backup plan is kind of this by committee approach that seems to be formulating here, with Greg Gantt being a potential option as a former 4-star guy that could play some minutes in that role. You've got Ernest Ross, the highest ranked guy in the 2021 recruiting class, coming in as an incoming freshman. He could also play some of those minutes at the power forward position. Again, this is all if NC State wants to go with the 3 forward lineup, which was not necessarily what Keats has always done. I mean, that's kind of the first time we saw it last year, and it was kind of by necessity. So we know that Jericho Helms and Manny Bates are going to be the minutes leaders. They're going to be probably the most used players on the court. If they're not in foul trouble and they're healthy, they're probably going to be playing 35, 40 minutes a night. So there are your answers at the 4 and 5. But if you wanted to go to a bigger lineup, which did yield some success for NC State towards the end of the year, you've got some options with Ross, Gantt. Plus there's, Jalen Gibson, who's going to have another offseason to develop. He needs to put on some weight and get stronger, but those are all attainable goals this offseason. And Ebenezer Duwana had a pretty quiet, I would probably say fairly disappointing first year, just based on his recruiting rankings and rating coming in. But he was also one of the guys that was impacted by that first COVID pause. So you almost kind of throw away that first season and see what he can do in the offseason. But a lot of question marks, it seems like, in the front court beyond those top 2 guys. But there's also, if you've got 4 scratch-offs, you'd suspect that maybe at least one of them is going to hit, right?
One hits. Yeah, I really like Gibson's an appealing prospect just because of his frame. He clearly wasn't ready to play in the ACC this year, but I mean, who knows? It's probably impossible for guys like you and I, even though we follow this stuff, we cover these teams, to just understand just how much these teams were impacted from a preparation standpoint because of COVID. And then you get into the season and guys are actually getting sick. And I mean, we're sort of just scratching the surface on seeing just how much that's impacting these high performance athletes, And last thing, I just want to touch on this real quickly because this may be the last a sort of a sign off of sorts here, but I really, really like DJ Funderburk at NC State. He was a really solid offensive player, underrated, in my opinion, across his 3 seasons. I thought last year, the 19-20 season, I thought DJ should have been all ACC that year, and I thought it was a pretty big mess up that he ended up not. I thought DJ was one of the top 10 to 12 players in the league last season. I actually thought he had a better year than Garrison Brooks, but no one wanted to have that conversation. But just will leave his career as a great interior scorer, shot 62% on twos, 78% from the line. This season he was a monster at the paint, 70% at the rim, 55 or what's it? You just never had the jumper, even though the free throw shot, you thought maybe that's an indicator of sorts, maybe he's a better shooter than we've seen. But it was never a great rebounder, never a great defender, though I think he was a pretty good communicator on that end. Even his junior season, I thought if you went to a state game, he was the guy you heard talking the most defensively, which I think matters. But yeah, drew a ton of got to the line a lot, and so was a good offensive rebounder, just a really solid inside 12 to 15 foot offensive scorer. Because he could draw contact, he could finish at the rim. Not much of a passer, obviously, but as a play finisher goes, he was pretty good at NC State. And I wish DJ the best of luck. I really enjoyed covering him in college. He was a very good player.
It's funny you mentioned the jumper conversation, because that was always topic of conversation the past 2 seasons, because he'd seemingly average about 1 3-point attempt per game and seemingly average 15 to 20% from 3, which is just not the type of production you need in order to get the green light to shoot 1 a game. But he was asked about it when he made that 3 against Davidson. I think he might have made 1 against Colorado State too, but he was he's like, I promise you I make him in practice. So
he also in the Davidson game, he hit a long 2 where his foot, his foot, one of his foot was on, it was very close to being another 3, which probably would have been the first, would have been probably the only time in his career he made multiple 3s in the game. He was inches away from it.
Right.
But yeah, he always tempted with that because you would see him try and like, there's nothing like mechanically, messed up with his shot. On a relatively small sample, it just never went in all that often.
Well, I would say that's a pretty thorough off-season conversation. I mean, I guess just one big picture parting shot here. ACC looks like it's going to improve next year just with some of the returning talent coming back. You suspect that Duke's going to be really good. Syracuse should probably take another step forward. There might be some question marks with Carolina, but Virginia's been active in the transfer market. Georgia Tech seems like it's going to have a lot of returning talent if they can maintain the Josh Pastner process there and he doesn't get stolen by one of the other programs that are looking for coaches. Virginia Tech is a perennial preseason top 10 team. Florida State, I mean, you just know that they're always going to have 10 dudes that are like 6'7", 6'8", that can run the floor, and Leonard Hamilton's always going to be there. So where do you kind of see NC State in the ACC picture? Do you see this as, a team that has the potential to make the NCAA tournament, and do you see anybody on this roster that could really make a solid, first or second team All-ACC type of campaign next year?
Yeah, I mean, assuming Bates comes back, I think he's sort of like the most obvious candidate to be like an All-ACC type guy. We've talked about this plenty. We didn't really touch on it much this pod, which is fine. But like Bates had just an awesome season defensively. I think he could be the best defensive player in the league next season, or he certainly has the opportunity. I would say he and Reese Beekman from Virginia are probably the two best defenders coming back to the league next season, but just keeps getting better. It's a pick and roll defender. Obviously, as a rim protector, he's truly elite. So I would say Bates is probably the most obvious guy. We'll see. Maybe he'll have more of the scoring numbers too next season if there's less Funderburk. Like, one would have to imagine Bates will absorb some of those touches. I'm not the biggest fan of Bates' post-up game, but he has gotten a lot better there. Certainly as a pick-and-roll guy, and as like a lob cutter, he's pretty good there. So I would say he's like the best guy, mostly because he's such a monster defensively, and I think he could put up pretty doggone good numbers. Where State finishes, I kind of think they're like I hate to say it, but like I kind of think they're in like a similar spot to where they were this season, like 8, 9, 10, somewhere like that. I think they're bringing back enough that they're going to be pretty good, pretty competitive. But I'm worried about them finding like consistently efficient offensive creation from the backcourt. No Devin Daniels. So how do the freshmen? I mean, there's a lot of talent with those guys, with Hayes and with Moore, but we got to see it, right? Mm-hmm. And losing Funderburk, losing the shooting of Beverly, I'm a little worried about their 3-point shooting for next season. I'm a little worried about just like where do they find guys to sort of like make up for the loss of Funderburk. But like I like the talent, I like the athleticism of this roster, I really do. I love Jericho Helms. Like I just think he had a really solid season, underrated. His usage jumped this year, but so too did his efficiency. He scores from every level of the court. And so, I don't know. I don't see him necessarily as an all-ACC guy, but like he kind of could if he had the scoring numbers, Like he's just a really solid player, improved as a playmaker in the middle of the court. So I'm excited to see what senior year Jericho Helms looks like because he made a jump this year. And does he have one more of those? Even if he doesn't, like he settled in as like a really nice starter in the ACC. I'd like to see him shoot even more threes because he's turned into a pretty good 3-point shooter. So like if he went for a little bit less of the long twos and more of the threes, I think that would be good. And maybe that would just sort of like juice his overall efficiency if he was able to successfully do that. So, but I think State more in the middle of the pack of the ACC. But I think there's a chance for them to like climb higher. It's a lot of it's going to depend on how do the rising second year guys and the rising third year guys like improve, and can they get more out of the Sebron, Moore, Hayes backcourt? Assuming all of these guys are coming back, which, at this point seems like that's the case, but you just never know, I guess, with the off season.
Well, in a season that, could be much better for the ACC, is obviously a down year for the ACC. Being middle of the pack, being that 7, 8, 9 team, they could, ACC could get 7, 8, 9 teams into the NCAA tournament if they improve.
Totally.
So I think obviously the goal is to get to the NCAA tournament. I don't think their ACC they matter, but I don't think that's the measuring stick goal. It's get to the NCAA tournament. If they can get to the NCAA tournament, I think you call next season a success, particularly with some of the younger personnel on the roster, because you suspect that a lot of these guys will also be returning the next season after that.
I think that's in the conversation for them too. Like, I know this seems like an annual tradition at this point, but I think they're going to be like running up against the bubble again next year. Right. I really do. I think that's like where this team sort of I think they're like a top. It depends on which projection model. Like you can look at the map, but I think they're going to end up being like a top 60 team. Somewhere in those whereabouts. And so just like, what does that mean for them in terms of the tournament? Like, it's flip a coin, So, but I don't think it's out of the case. I think they have enough talent, enough like veteran presence coming back, plus like a decent recruiting class coming in too. So like they have the whereabouts of a team that could be pretty good, could be competitive. And I just don't think it's out of the question that they make the tournament. It's maybe important for Kevin Keatts that they do, honestly.
Yes, but I would not doubt that at all. It's very important for him probably to get to the NCAA tournament next year. But I mean, last thing would just be that because of the talent in the college game right now, it's okay to be a bubble team. Just look at UCLA. They made it to the Final Four as a first four team, first four team to do so. NBA's stealing a lot of early talent, so it's not like you need a top 4 seed to make it far in the dance. As long as you get there, your destiny's up to you. But Brian, thank you so much for the generosity of your time. I thought that was a pretty thorough review of the offseason. Please remember to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast wherever you listen to us. We're on Apple Podcast app, Spotify, Google Play. You can always listen to us on the Wolfpacker.com. Use that promo code PACK60 while you're there for a free 60-day trial on all of our premium content, news, and analysis. You can watch us on YouTube, follow our YouTube channel, or subscribe, rather, to our YouTube channel. And please give this video a thumbs up. Follow us on social media. You can follow our main account at the Wolfpacker on Twitter. You can follow Brian at bguys_bird. That's bguys_bird on Twitter. And then you can follow me personally at Justin H. Will on Twitter. Give us a like on Facebook, NC State Wolfpack on the Wolfpacker.com. And for Brian Geisinger, this is Justin Williams, and this has been the Wolfpacker Hoops Talk podcast.